Welcome back to JLF's Brave New World Friday Booker series. Our magazine partner for the series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Those of you who missed our earlier episode from our special Book of Friday, Writing Family of Doshi and Diksha Basu in Conversation, you can catch this on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and on our Facebook pages, JLF Litfest. Our next session today is The Shadow King, Maaza Mengiste in conversation with Nandini Nair. Maaza Mengiste was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. A Fulbright scholar and professor at Queen's College, he is the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze and a 2018 recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Here she talks to Nandini Nair about her new novel, The Shadow King. Maaza Mengiste is the author of the novels Beneath the Lion's Gaze, selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books, and The Shadow King, one of New York Times' notable books of 2019 and Times 100 must-read books of 2019, and has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize for 2020. Nandini Nair is the literary and cultural editor of Open magazine. She writes on social and cultural issues. All our sessions that have been broadcast till now are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions and comments by typing it into the comment section below. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, the Shadow King.
Hi, Maza. It's wonderful to have you here. Um, I, I think in the author's note, you described the book best, and you called it The Shadow King Tells the Story of Those Ethiopian Women Who Fought Alongside Men Who Have Remained No More Than Errant Lines in Faded Documents. And I think that absolutely wonderfully captures the spirit of your book. I know you spent a long time researching the book, and it took 10 years to come to fruition. So can we talk a little bit about that, about the challenges of writing historical fiction, of writing an important story, and how you sort of use your imagination to flesh out something that is from the past?
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. That's a really good opening question. I think that one of the things I had to understand when I decided I wanted to look at this history, I was interested in it. I had heard the stories from when I was a kid. But very early on, when I started researching, I realized there is a lot to know here. It's set, these are the early days of World War II. How much am I going to look at in order to begin to write a book? What is it that I really want to know? I was researching everything I could for a while. And then at some point, it struck me that as much information as there is about this history, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of history within that history that we don't know yet. And I started to find these very brief mentions of women, sometimes a photograph, sometimes a headline, sometimes one short article. And I realized I could spend 20 years researching, and maybe this is all I'm going to find of this stuff. And that let me know that there's a whole history beneath this that has not been written about. I don't know much about it. I want to know this thing because I have a question. And every book begins with a question. It begins with what you don't know that grabs your attention. And I understood I had found one of the many gaps in history, and I wanted to pursue that. And that's probably why it took 10 years to write. But I found this moment I didn't know about, and frankly, not many other people knew it either, except for those women who fought. And I decided to pursue that and use my imagination because, again, there just was not that much information. And it was really following the traces that they left behind which meant the photographs that they appeared in, the locations where they were, the documents I could find about those locations, and maybe sometimes the military units that were based there, the Italians. And from that, I constructed a world.
But was there a particular question in your mind, something that you had framed and put on your notice board, for example, that led to this?
Well, you know, I don't know if I placed anything on my board, but I will tell you that what I did do was I placed a small note on my computer pretty early on in the writing of this. And it had less to do with the research and more to do with the writing. I put a small note that said, give yourself space to fail.
Right.
And what really that meant for me and for my imaginative process was, you have got to go big. You have got to move into this territory. You've got to push your comfort levels with writing, with what you think a book can do, with what you think you can do,
Right.
and give yourself that room. And if you fail, at least it's going to be spectacular. I wanted a disaster, or I did not want a tepid failure. If I failed and people think I failed, let it be big.
Right. And if you and if you succeed, it's also spectacularly, right? There's no in between then.
There's no in between. I mean, as for most of us as writers, as creative people, I think every project that we are working on, we are not writing that book. We're preparing ourselves for the next book. Right. And that next book should be preparation for the next book. So we continue to grow. And that's how I saw this book also.
When you talk about going big, I think this book is right, because there are multiple voices. There's a chorus that's talking. Then there are photographs that are being described. There are various viewpoints, etc. So can we talk a little bit about how did you decide to create that, for example?
Initially I didn't know what I didn't think that was the way that I would approach the book. But again, the minute I told myself, you cannot be afraid to fail. What is it that you want to do with this? I understood that the story of war, or at least the stories of history, of how we know a nation's history or a people's history, is recorded in many different ways. It's of course told through stories, but it's told also through photographs that we have of family members, photographs we take of certain events in our lives. That's how we create a history of ourselves. And it's also told through the music that we listen to, the way that a neighborhood has certain gossip about certain people, and they will never outlive that, no matter what, because that's just how gossips are. Right. This is what makes a history. It's not in a classroom, and it's not in a university or in a library. The history exists amongst the people. So how could I create a book that reflects the many different ways that we remember, and also the ways that we try to forget certain things?
Right. So that kind of brings me to the next question, which I think is also sort of fundamental to your book. Why do we not know about the women who fought in the Ethiopian War against the Italian invasion? Why are those stories not remembered?
Well, I think a few things. How do you begin to speak of war as a man who's been to war and describe a woman fighting next to you, when war is supposed to be a way to define masculinity? How do you begin to define your own masculinity and what manhood is, if you also have to contend with this woman fighting, as brave as you are, next to you? And I think that these stories got silenced because no one quite knew how to grapple with them. I think the women knew these stories. I've begun to think that they knew, and they spoke to each other in the spaces of women, in the kitchens, in the homes, in those rooms where women would gather when the men would sit on the other side. And the histories got carried down because my great-grandmother went to war. My aunts knew this. I did not know it until I had happened to stumble upon it, but they had shared these stories amongst themselves. And I think this is where the stories of women were kept. No one wanted to listen because war is a man's territory.
I think it's fascinating. I think even in the novel, you mentioned it at the end about how you found out about your great grandmother having taken part in the war only once you had nearly finished the research of the book. And there was sort of an incident in your own family history about your great grandmother and the gun that comes into the novel, which you didn't know. It was a coincidence. So can we tell the audience a bit about that serendipity in a way?
Yeah, I had gone to Ethiopia for one of my it was a last minute research trip. I was supposed to have the book almost fully edited, but I needed to go look at these locations or else I was not going to turn in that book until I could go. My mother and I went. She often travels with me in Ethiopia for my research. We drove for hours, 8, 9, 10 hours a day for how many days, traveling from location to location. And when we got back, I happened to mention to her one of the photographs that I have of one of my female soldiers and the stories that I was connecting to the locations. And she just casually mentioned, well, what about your great grandmother? And I remember it was at night and we were tired, and I looked at her and I could not believe that after all the years of research and conversation and she just casually mentioned this. And I asked her, why didn't you tell me this? She said, well, you didn't ask.
Oh, wow.
So she knew it. My aunts knew it. Other women in my family knew it. I did not grow up in the kitchens with them. I mean, I was in school in the United States. I missed that history that would have been passed down to me. But they spoke about it, but they didn't speak about it with the men.
Right. You left Ethiopia as a child. I think you were 5, and you grew up in the US. So what was it like sort of discovering the country as a novelist?
So my knowledge of Ethiopia strengthened, but it became clearer as a result of writing.
Right. Do you think if you hadn't left Ethiopia, these books would not have happened in a way? Do you think the departure was necessary for creation?
It would have been a very tough road.
Right.
It would have been really tough to become a writer, partly because, like every other parent, mine wanted me to be a doctor. Right. That's the respectable, I'm sure you know. It's the respectable thing, and if you can't do that, they might compromise and accept an engineer, and then maybe a lawyer, and then those are the things.
Right.
It was not in my vocabulary to be a writer or to be anything creative. We didn't know anyone creative. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew growing up was that I liked to read, and I had no concept of what it meant to write. So my God, I cannot imagine the fights if I stayed and discovered this is what I wanted to do. I mean, it was bad enough from the United States calling my family saying I was going to study literature.
Right. So have they made peace with the fact that you're not a doctor? Are they proud that you're a writer?
Finally. It took after the first book was published. It really took that long.
Right.
For them to stop sending me applications for, different UN positions. Yeah, so it's...
You can't save lives, but we can put you on the shelf. It's not a bad deal.
Yeah.
What were some of the stories as a child growing up that you knew about the Italian invasion? Because I think...
Yeah. I knew the stories of the men in my family. I knew the stories of heroism. I knew that Ethiopia had been invaded. The people rose heroically. The men fought in the army. The women helped by preparing food, getting water, those types of things. And then we won. But I had no sense of war on a daily basis, that what does it mean on a day-to-day basis to be in war? What happened to the women? What was really going on in those camps with groups of people traveling? If you're a husband and wife and you're fighting before war, and then you're in a camp together, you've got to be fighting then too. It's just a different, So what did war look like from that domestic experience? And I did not know that story.
Right. I think, like in journalism and in history, it's the omissions that are important, right? And it's the omissions that one sort of tries to rectify down the line. When it comes to colonialism, of course, and I guess living in India, we are very aware of the British Empire, right? That's something we've lived with, it's something we've experienced. But I think when it comes to Italian colonization, it seems less talked about. Maybe I'm mistaken about that. But do you think that's the case? Do you think that's sort of been, and like I think you mentioned even in an article about how, there's generally a belief that, the Italians are nice people. But you have, from your own family stories, from your own stories of being colonized, that wasn't the case. That wasn't true.
Yeah, it was really, there is this sense, there's an amnesia in Italy, and I think also partly in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the stories that were told of Italians were always stories of Ethiopian defiance and Ethiopian heroism. From the Italian side, the Italians didn't want to talk about this. They didn't want to divulge or release what they had really done in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Somalia, in Libya. They wanted to create and perpetuate this myth of the Italians as the better colonialists. They were better and kinder than the British. They're better than the French. They're too good-natured. They're too disorganized. They like music and wine and finer things too much to create a real war. And in fact, they were good for Ethiopia because they built roads. So this is what you hear. And on the Ethiopian side, you hear, well, we won. But it wasn't until just recently that my mother told me of one of my relatives who had been fighting in the war against the Italians, a man. It was my grandmother's brother. The Italians decapitated him and put his head in the market for his family to find. So that's just one family story, and I have so many. I just learned this one about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Italians created an apartheid-like system in Ethiopia 11 to 13 years before apartheid was officially instituted in South Africa. What they did in Libya with the concentration camps and the aerial warfare they fought both there and in Ethiopia with poison gas broke every humanitarian law, every law of war. All the roads that they built, if you go to Ethiopia, they're really inconvenient and they don't make sense because the roads only led from one military camp to the other. So they built the roads to destroy the country. So all these things, and Italians were very organized and very cruel. They came back and didn't want to talk about it. So you have that amnesia. And also in Ethiopia, this refusal to say, in these years, we were dominated. We were occupied. There was an occupying force. There was a colonial force in the country. We were, for those 5 years, not in control. And that's another story. And, if we get into that, then we get into collaborators. And if we get into collaborators, we talk about, well, who really didn't want Haile Selassie as emperor? Let's talk about that. So there's all this stuff that comes in once you start unpacking the silence. Yeah.
You did a fair amount of research in Rome and you spent a lot of time in the archives there. So what was it like sort of grappling with these, like you mentioned, these versions of history? Like there's one story that you hear in Italy and there's one story you hear in Ethiopia. And then as a novelist, you kind of decide which is the most authentic. How do you go about it?
I started when I was in the archives. I really quickly I realized, wait a minute, I'm reading what people want me to read. I'm reading the documents that had been approved by the fascists, the newspapers that had been censored already, all this stuff. In Ethiopia, I had these other stories that I just mentioned to you. And I realized that maybe one of the best things I could do was get out of the libraries, move away from the archives, and really just start talking to people. And so I started asking friends of mine whose relatives fought in the war with Ethiopia, what do you remember? What stories can you provide? I started looking for letters and diaries that soldiers kept. And in those diaries and the photographs that they took, that they kept with them, so it didn't have to go through censor, that's where the real war opened up for me. I heard the things that they would say only to themselves about what they did. And that's really where the research began.
I'd like to talk about photographs because I think that also plays a big role in The Shadow King. So you have a character, Ettore. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. And he is a photographer and he takes these images, and I mean, there's a big subplot to it, which we will not reveal right now, but it connects him to one of the other characters in the novel as well. So yeah, can you tell me a bit about the importance of a chronicler or documenter, and especially in a novel like this?
Yeah, I think any groups of people who have been colonized understand the power of the image to create a narrative about who should be ruled and who is the ruler.
Right.
Colonizers, explorers would come in and into any country, whether it's Africa or across Asia, and take photographs of people as a way to say, look how different they are from us. And that means that the photographer is the standard and everybody else is a deviation.
The other.
Curious about the ways that photography became a language and a weapon of war, a way to create victims before the war even went into the country, so that those people who invaded could then say, well, we had to do it. Right. Because look at these people. And I was curious in what I might learn by making my character Ettore a photographer. Are there ways that I could learn to see differently as a result of working with this character for so long? And I don't put his photographs in the book. I don't put the actual pictures in there. But I do have word images. And what I wanted to do in writing was find a way to move past the frame of a photograph and have the viewer or have the reader look just beyond that to see what actually happened prior to or right after an image was taken. I wanted to see if through language I could move somebody from being a witness to actually being a part of this scene. So I was working with this line that we often have between subject and observer.
Like you mentioned about how a photographer is sort of he decides, right, what is exotic, what is not, in a way, and he frames it within his camera lens. Writers do that as well, right? And you talk about, I think you mentioned Evelyn Waugh, that was a name that just stuck with me, and about, they speak about the sun, the fly, the heat, the decrepit huts, the unwashed natives. And again, I think as a reader in India, it's something one can totally identify with, right? Like even someone like a Rudyard Kipling, who we might might love his writing. His animal stories are wonderful. Bagheera is a great character, but he had certain issues with how he talked about the natives. So, yeah, could we talk a bit about that? The necessity of people telling their own stories and away from the white gaze.
Yeah. I you have Kipling, you have Evelyn Waugh, you have Richard Kapuscinski, you have these men that have created a way of depicting people who look like you and look like me. But what they're actually doing with every rendering, every bigoted and racist rendering, is creating an image of themselves. And when I remember reading Evelyn Waugh, every chapter, like if he were here, I would punch him out. Really punch him out. And I know that in real life he did get punched out, and I'm glad he did by people.
And if you met Kipling?
Probably, yeah, I would punch them all out. Why not? They have done enough, I think. But what do? I mean, we write in response to that. And actually, at some point, we write and completely forget them, because what we're writing is no longer connected to responding, but something that is our own. But I was thinking about the way that Evelyn Waugh and we can go back to Kipling. We can go to Orwell and the way that he was rendering the people that he supposedly did feel a sense of compassion, but there was still a caste, there was still a hierarchy of race, even in his writing. So we have these. When I remember sitting down to write at some point, and I literally felt like there was a flood of this history of that, writing behind me. And how would I approach the book that's in front of me? Am I going to address them? Or am I going to tell the history and the story that I want to tell independent of it? I put that brief line with Waugh in the book. I was thinking I could do chapters. I think I'm not going to do that. This story is about Ethiopians. It's about this. He's irrelevant.
Right.
I think reading them has informed me of how literature can be myopic, but I think we're at a point as creatives and as writers where we're post that. I mean, we're writing something that is so much more complicated and nuanced and rich. It's richer than what a lot of them have done. It takes in a lot more knowledge and a lot more awareness. And I would rather read those writers than worry so much about what people have done in the past.
Right. I'm just going to pick on one line that you said about punching Evelyn Waugh. It's a great line. And talk about, it's something, we're running out of time, so I'm going to sort of hurry up, and talk about the importance of women's rage. And I think that it is essential. And I think that rage, in fact, informs change. And I think rage is necessary. And your two characters, I think Hirut and Aster, you talk about them being remolded in rage in a way. So can you, let's discuss that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as girls, we are raised to in a certain, these unruly sides of what it means to be a human being. The things that can't be neatly contained in what a girl is supposed to be, which is very proper and very polite and quiet and maybe timid or shy, but not too forward. We're raised, at least I was raised like that. That's just a cultural expectation. Right. And if you don't fit that, if you laugh too loud, or you would punch a man out. What do you do with that? How does a culture contain this? Because women and girls are raised to accommodate the needs and the desires and, frankly, the insecurities of men. And if a girl or a woman shows her anger, it shows her as independent. It shows her as uncontainable. unrestrained and unrestrainable.
Right.
And what is a man going to do with that? What will society do? And it worries them because it's not about the woman, it's about them. It reflects a weakness if they can contain that woman. And I can imagine an army of women being uncontained and uncontainable. And I was curious about the way that rage, if allowed to flourish, the way it was with Hirut and the way with Aster, she didn't try to dampen it. She worked with it.
She made it her strength.
She made it her strength. And what would a woman look like? And what would a girl look like if she said, I will mold myself out of rage instead of trying to take the rage away? And I found that a really interesting approach to looking at these female characters.
Which sort of brings me to, I think, maybe one of my last questions. What we're seeing right now in the US, that's rage on the street, right? It's about people saying that they are uncontainable, that they will not be treated a certain way. As an Ethiopian writer in the US right now, what is your response to what's happening there?
Well, there's a wonderful literary organization, a collective called Afro-Lit Sans Frontières, and it originated from a festival, an online festival created by Zukiswa Vanner, who lives in Kenya, in Nairobi. And there's a group of writers that I am friends with, and we're from different parts of the African continent. We have been talking about these protests, and a group drafted a letter in support of Black Lives Matter, in support of the protests, because this protest and the rage and the vocalization of that anger, the loudness of it, is an attempt to reflect the loud and vicious bigotry that has kept killing and oppressing Black people in America, but also in the diaspora in Brazil. There was just a newspaper article I read today of a 14-year-old boy who was shot and killed by Brazil. These are not isolated incidents. It's not only the United States. India has its own issues with ethnicity. But as an Ethiopian, as an immigrant, as an American, I was very happy to sign this letter that Afro-Lit Sans Frontières put together in support of this. I stand behind Black Lives Matter. And as the letter states, we see African Americans and Black people around the diaspora as our brothers and sisters. It breaks my heart.
Right.
I was watching this, over the course of a few days, and Nandini, I have to, there are a few times where I felt like I need to call her and just say, I don't think I can do this. But I'm glad that we're talking. And we stand with them. I stand with them.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to go to an audience question. So this is from Mudit. He says, is the oral tradition alive in Africa are stories passed from one generation to another?
I think they are passed. I've had again and again people tell me, I wish I had talked to my grandmother or my grandfather before they passed away. I wish I had talked to my parents more. The stories are there. And I have to say, Nandini, that I had a conversation with someone from India, because I have a few photographs of Indians who were in Ethiopia during the war as part of the British forces. And he went back and his mother told him, oh yeah, your uncle was there. So I'm telling people, they have our stories and we need to talk to
them. So this is from Rachita. She says, why are natives from ex-colonial countries labeled immigrant, while in contrast, there's the concept of expats?
Why are natives called natives? I would just ask her that. Why does she just call them natives?
No, but she put it in air quotes.
Okay. It's privilege, it's money, it's this sense that the only way you travel as a Black person is to flee or be a refugee. But white people are fleeing all the time, and Italians were trying to immigrate to Ethiopia, and it was an invasion.
So this is a question from Sachdev Ramakrishna. He says, can you tell us a bit about your work on human rights and your involvement with Warscapes and Words Without Borders?
I'm on the boards of both of those online journals. They are fantastic. I would encourage anyone to look them up, Warscapes and Words Without Borders. My work has been really an attempt to just write what I see, what I experience, the things that that particularly hit close to home, which for me is migration, and what is happening to people who are trying to cross the Mediterranean. It's the thing that keeps me up at night. And there's so many things going on in the world, but that one thing, for some reason, is the thing that I want to keep writing about and keep learning and do my very, very small part.
This is an interesting question from Shireen. She says, would you comment on the origin of the term shooting a photograph?
You know what? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually.
Yeah.
I was trying to find that origin a while ago, because we capture an image. We shoot a photograph. And again, I think this is the language of you point at something. Right. This is how the camera went with explorers and went with colonialists and was always accompanied by violence. The guns went with the cameras. And the actions, the language became interchangeable.
Right. Agastya says, you learned Italian to research your book. Did that bring you closer to the history of the Italians?
Absolutely. I could talk to people. Absolutely. I could talk to people one-on-one and hear their stories, and it became a much richer experience for me.
Okay. Since I think we still have maybe, a couple of minutes left, I'm going to do a word association, which I always think ends up being fun with authors. And let's see how that goes. So yeah, I'm just going to shoot out words and let's see your response to it.
Oh, no.
Don't worry. The army.
Wait, army?
Yeah.
Oh, I suddenly had grenade. I don't know why.
Okay, we'll go with grenade if you want.
Okay. So wait, what am I supposed to do now? Find another word?
No, what is it, when you hear that word, what is your response to it?
Well, when I hear the army, clearly it's impossible not to think of the United States right now, and the way it's becoming militarized and the curfews. But I also think of the army of women that were always there. These, it's, the title of my book is The Shadow King, and these women were they were the Shadow King. When the king left, they didn't replace the queen; they replaced the king, who was the ruler of Ethiopia. Right. So I imagine them as well. There's always a shadow army. That's also a fantastic movie by Melville called The Army of Shadows. So they're
really?
Association, which is fantastic.
Let's talk about shadows. I also found it interesting how in your book there's so many images of light. If one was to make a list, there would be an unlimited list. So what is your association with shadows? What do you think when one says that?
A shadow can carve out features. It can create something. It can also obscure an object. And I was really interested in the interplay between light and shadow. My book was dealing with photographs, which is what, a camera works with that. I was looking at the way that, Leonardo Da Vinci was in his notebooks was really studying this aspect of how do you render a human being on a canvas and working with light and shadow. And I was reading his work and was completely mesmerized by his thinking of it. He has a line that I use in my book, which is something along the lines of every human body is surrounded by shadow and light. And so you have to figure out which way you're going to bend in order to bring that up. And that for me is also a metaphor for life.
I think this session with JLF is titled A Brave New World. And also I think your book deals with it. When you hear the word bravery, what comes to mind?
I think of these protesters right now who are facing these police who are in military gear. They are unarmed and they are standing there peacefully for the most part. I'm in awe of that. And if there's a spirit, there's a certain kind of spirit that's in my book. It's also there with those protesters. Those women who decided to fight against the fascists reflect, the bravery of some of these protesters who are fighting a fascist state.
Right. When you hear the word Addis Ababa, what comes to mind?
New flower, which is the Amharic meaning Addis Ababa. Flower. So I just imagine a flower. It's very crowded now. It wasn't that way, but it's been getting astonishingly crowded. The traffic is horrible. It rivals New York. But I think of the music and the food. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I miss it.
What do you miss most about home?
My family is there. So I really love going there and spending time with my family. When I'm in Addis Ababa, I think some of the best times have been those moments when I leave the city and go into the mountains, and the country is beautiful. That feels like home when I'm there.
Right. Oh, okay. I think we're out of time. We will now, I think, move back to Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, Nandini Nair, and thank you and congratulations, Maaza Mengiste, and all of this gloom and doom being shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Many, many congratulations. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. And we hope to see you next week. But we do want you to, if possible, block your date on the 4th of October 2020 for a fabulous program that we've put together to celebrate the arts. As you all know, the devastation due to COVID-19 across the cultural sector has been huge. Teamwork Fine Arts Society is curating a multi-arts charity event, I Believe Art Matters. The initiative aims to raise financial support and resources for artists and artisans and celebrate their craft and tradition by bringing their stories to the forefront. I Believe Art Matters will be hosted by actors Shabana Azmi and Manoj Bajpai and will premiere on Facebook, weaving together performances and conversations for approximately 5 hours with over 400 featured artists, including the likes of A.R. Rahman, Salim Suleiman, Shekhar Rabkiani, and the Shalom Chengpa Choir, Dr. L. Subramaniam, Kailash Kher, Raghu Dikshit, Indian Ocean, Shabnam Birmani, Ankur Tiwari, Usha Uttup, Advaita, Selva Ganesh and Shivamani, Ranjit Barrett, Viku Vinayak, Ram, Shubhendru Rao and Saskia, and so much more. Please do block your dates and see you on the 4th of October.